And there are only 800 Americans studying in China. 800. That means that if you want to re-strengthen that, you need to know how it was re-established in the first place, right?
Exactly.
So right now we don't know. To my shock, there is nothing available on how the relations are re-established. So either basically you preserve it right now, because people still alive are like 80, 85, 90 sometimes, 95 even, or you lose all this critical information. Chinese came to the US to make history, and Americans came here more of interest, to have like an interesting life experience, and they, maybe continued in it, but that's it.
So in your conversations with people who came here during 1978, what distinctions do you draw between that period and this period, and what are some of the things that are still transferable?
My work is more than a blueprint of what happened then. And a blueprint, is never a perfect way that the building is actually built. It's just like gives you an idea on what was roughly the idea at the time. Scientists at the time were often trained at Tsinghua University through Boxer and MIT scholarships afterwards in the US. I'm thinking here of Joel Pei-Juan, the previous president of Peking University, who studied with Einstein. But to some extent, the Americans and the Chinese see a different world when they use their internet. And that ironically puts them further apart from each other. It means they have less engagement.
Another aspect of it was the business development that was happening during that time. A lot of joint ventures were coming up during that time. Can you share a little bit more of what you discovered during your research about that aspect of it?
We often talk about, it was so naive of the United States to engage with China in this way. Like, should we have engaged with a rival power in the development? And I would say what you should do if you want to answer that is speak to the people who actually did that. Both sides were interested in having this type of engagement. People often think that America want to have this type of engagement because they want to make China a liberal democracy like its own. That's not true. If you speak with the people involved, they were not trying to do that. What they were trying to do is to build a buffer against the never-ending Cold War, against the USSR, the great bear up north. And the American and the Chinese side had different incentives. The American side wanted to make money. The Chinese side wanted to have the best technology. I have people in interviews that talked about, that the Chinese side really said explicitly, we don't just want technology you got laying around, we want to have the best technology you guys have.
There is a saying that learn from history or else you are bound to repeat it. But in this case, the opposite is the intention. So we are in a stage where US-China relations are being talked about a lot on this segment of understanding China better. Today I have with me Koen Smeets, a Yenching scholar, a scholar practitioner of US-China academic relations who's trying to preserve the oral history of US-China relations. Koen is trying to learn from history to be able to replicate the effects of it in the future to ensure that the US-China relations can improve. Learning from 1978, when the initiative was taken to improve people-to-people exchanges, to improve business relations between both the countries, and by talking to the people who were the first generation of Americans to come to China, who were the first people to have that exposure to China, that is a thing that is significantly required even in today's time. So Koen, welcome on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be interviewed by another colleague that also works on having the world understand China better. So my name is Koen. I'm a Yenching scholar at Peking University, and through my oral history I aim to preserve how American re-engagement with China started in 1978. So I interviewed the very people that normalized US-China relations, the very first Americans that studied in China, the very first 8, as well as the about 50 after the normalization, and as well the people right now we're expanding to cover the deans, directors, the chancellors of Sino-American joint venture universities, centers and other institutions.
What got you interested in this topic? Was it the fact that the US-China relations were strained, or was it even before that that you had that kind of intrigue about China and US?
So I think for me the question often comes down to 2 questions. Firstly, why China? And then why US? So I remember when I was quite a little kid, I remember sitting in my middle school library and they had this book sale. And they had a book on China, China's history. And I was just blown away by how old its history was and how different the philosophical system. But I had to wait a bit till I really returned to it. That was during my university studies when I did an exchange. And before that I got also interested in the US, especially after Trump won. I was curious as what is the economic motivation. I'm trained as an economist, but these days I'm especially focused on people-to-people relations. And so I did quite a bit of research on the US then, its political system. I did an exchange with Beida, I made my first podcast on the socio-economic impact of technology, interviewed many leading people thanks to my involvement and my team in various hackathons. I was very lucky to be able to engage there. And from that on, I started to interview about 45 experts, many of them also Americans lead universities, and many other places. And through that, I was able to do an exchange with Beda, and then got into the Yenching Academy of Peking University, where I've been able to continue this research. So that's basically US and white China. And then I had an amazing class at Yenching from one of the very first 8 Americans that studied here, Frank Hawk. And that's how I basically got rolling. He had some time left that semester, and I was so interested by the stories he told that I asked him, look, can I maybe write a paper on this? And he said, sure. And he put me in touch with some people, and I was just amazed. And I started looking into the literature, and to my shock, there is nothing available on how the relations are reestablished. So either basically you preserve it right now, because people still alive are like 80, 85, 90 sometimes, 95 even. And so you either interview them right now, or you lose all this critical information. And there are only 800 Americans studying in China, 800. That means that if you want to re-strengthen that, you need to know how it was re-established in the first place, right?
Exactly.
So right now we don't know. So you either basically get that information right now, or you lose critical information for policymakers. And then it was really seeing like the difficulties of my Chinese friends and just how few Americans are here that then drove me to continue with this project.
In your conversations with all these first-generation Americans who came to China, who tried to re-establish those relations, what has been some of the key takeaways that you've found, these common points that most of them have? Yeah. And what are some of the anecdotes that you can share that were interesting, and through those conversations you got to realize, oh, this is something that nobody tells you?
Yeah. Well, if you look like at the few things available right now, Chinese came to the US to make history, and Americans came here more of interest, to have like an interesting life experience, and they, maybe continued in it, but that's it. If you actually speak with them, you learn that they played a critical role in China, in everything from technology transfer till development of China's legal system. I've been very lucky to speak to people that did business development here, and you see they played such a critical role in that. And the same for commercial law, that people have played a critical role in, building the commercial law here, basically. And when you speak with them, you learn that the subtle cultural understanding of China, it goes beyond language. It goes towards having an actual deep understanding of how people engage and talk with each other. I think you being here as a Schwarzman school, you get what I mean. Like over that year here, you gain an understanding how the society truly works, how people think, how people act, how people talk. And you can only get that by being here. And I think by them being here, they built that. And that's what enabled them to, I think, be key players in US China relations. And exactly what worries me, but there are so few Americans here right now.
Being a Schwarzman scholar, I can also tell that it's easy to get lost in your own bubble. And if you have like a circle of friends, international friends that you can always rely upon, then there's very little incentive to go out and actually integrate yourself with the Chinese society or talk to your Chinese counterparts. Yeah. So what kind of distinctions have you seen in the American perspective of things, of the Americans that you've talked to, and the Chinese perspective of things, of the Chinese people that you might have talked to, about establishing those relations? What kind of efforts were made on both parts to re-engage and ensure that those relations were strengthened, instead of just the Americans sticking to their people and the Chinese sticking to their people?
It's very interesting you mentioned that. This is indeed something that really concerns me. I think I try at least to be relatively well integrated here, to speak with both the American and the Chinese counterpart. I am quite involved at Beda, and say the largest club there, the Innovation Society. I'm involved in trying to speak with various people.
Does it help that you're Dutch?
It helps because it means that I can take a more neutral position. The way that I look at this is that I can take a unique neutral position in this debate. And of course it's complex what neutral means here, but what I mean with it is that I am less asked to take a side. I have my American credentials and I have my Chinese credentials. And over time I hope to expand both of them and to basically facilitate conversation between both sides. That's the key thing that I try to do. I work with a team of about 20 students from all the leading universities in the US and China, both Chinese and American. Also different nationalities like myself, but primarily from there. And that means that I can facilitate engagement in a period in which we have less and less of that. And my career goal is to keep going with that. And to do that, I need to be well integrated here, to understand the society, to understand the people, to have as many conversations as I can, like these. with Americans, with Chinese, with people from other nationalities, to understand the way that things really work. I'm really a people person, so I love to have as many of that engagements as I can. And you mentioned before as well that that many people stay within their bubble, and that's something that really concerns me, because if there are only 800 Americans here and they often stay in their bubble, yeah, that is something that really, that I think means that they will have less engagement and understanding of China than they would have if they came here without that. And that's why I think, you know, the first generations of scholars, and thinking here of, say, really the older China hands, China experts, they really had extensive engagement in China. They didn't have the opportunity to really rely on each other. So they really had to make friends here. If you look right now, both Americans here might stay in their bubble, and especially the Chinese in the US, I can imagine, they're often talked about, like, you know, they stay within their bubble. I think there's a lot of truth to that. So they can stay within their own bubble, even at elite universities. So that means that they will have less engagement with the American society. So though you have 275,000 there, many of them might not have the extended engagement you might expect them to have when they are studying there. So I think that means that policy communities are not growing apart, but less integrated over time, over this 45 years of U.S.-China academic relations. And I hope that over time they might grow together a bit, and that's something I see as critical as well of my work.
But do you think the efforts that were made in 1978, are they necessarily transferable in today's time? Because today's contemporary times are like completely different. You have more integration through WeChat groups and WhatsApp groups. You have more integration through social media. You have better ways to stay connected with your own people instead of having the incentive to go talk to others. Even if you talk about the language barrier, like if you're living in China, right now you can rely on your translator, so you don't necessarily even need to have that incentive to either learn the language or go out and excessively make those efforts. So in your conversations with people who came here during 1978, what distinctions do you draw between that period and this period, and what are some of the things that are still transferable?
Yeah. Well, you're totally right. I couldn't agree more with that. So, to some extent, my work is more than a blueprint of what happened then. And a blueprint, you know, is never a perfect way that a building is actually built. It's just like gives you an idea on what was roughly the idea at the time. I think we can take a lot of inspiration from that. I think one of the things that I learned from it is that scientists at the time were often trained at Tsinghua University through Boxer and MIT scholarships afterwards in the US. I'm thinking here of Joe Peijuan, the previous president of Peking University, who studied with Einstein. And he was very fiercely a proponent of China, but also of having international engagement in the scientific sphere. So he would definitely been a leader proposing more and more academic engagement. And so were many of the scientists on the Chinese side. So I think it shows that there are people that were proponents. I think that will also be very similarly true today. And at the same time, you also have people that might have been less in favor of this type of engagement. So you have to basically balance that. And through conversations with these people that actually did the negotiations, I learned how they balance that. And I think that could provide critical ideas for current and future American policymakers on how to engage in this debate, especially if they are no longer here, that they can still hear in their own voice. Especially maybe 20, 30 years from now, when you can no longer ask these people how they did it. So that's, I think, the first part of my answer. It's more of a blueprint. And secondly, I very strongly agree with you. Like, it's a very different time. We have WeChat. I think one irony of WeChat is that you probably will experience as well. Like, to some extent, the system here is separate. Like, they have a separate internet ecosystem here. Like, just trying to pay here is so incredibly complex. And that also means that gathering information is very, very complex. So to some extent, the Americans and the Chinese see a different world when they use their internet. And that ironically puts them further apart from each other. It means they have less engagement. It's like when you probably had it as well, when you first come here just using an app like Meituan or Didi. It's complex. It's hella complex. So you learn over time how to deal with that, how to do that. But it means that you basically work in separate spheres, with separate internet ecosystems, with make access sometimes more difficult. Instead of the internet then being an inclusive force, it's an exclusive force, which is very, very complex.
But what do you think about the structure of Chinese and American policy making? They're completely different than each other. Not only the political system, but the way these systems work is like completely different. So how do you think even that influences the way U.S.-China relations are and will be?
So there's a lot of angles you can take here. But when you were talking about this, I was thinking on the way that people here advise the government and the way that these structures work, right? So if you look at the American side, people rotate in and out of government positions, and think tanks and academia, they will rotate in and out of these positions. Like at some point they might be advising the administration, at other points they might be writing academic papers, and at some points they might be writing more think tank reports, right? They rotate in and out over these institutions. In the Chinese side, I think this is a bit different. So basically you have people in academia writing reports, but most likely they will stay in academia over time.
We're talking to all those people who came to China during that period in 1978, but have you had conversations with their Chinese counterparts as well, or has it been only the Americans who came here? What has been the perspective of the Chinese counterparts who they were interacting with?
I'm still working on that. So you have to consider I started this project relatively recently. So over the next maybe lifetime, I will be working like on this, and my goal is to interview as many people that work constructively on this as possible. So I've done a few interviews in this related, and they've been incredibly fascinating because you get to speak to people that seen basically the rise of U.S. China relations and the development of China simultaneously, and then as well, like right now, the deteriorating of the relation. So it's incredibly interesting to ask the people that were involved in these type of ways, how do you feel about that? On the American side, and similarity is that I've asked the person that set up Fulbright, how do you feel about Fulbright in China being cancelled? Right now I'm interviewing the very first Fulbright scholar from China to the US. So these are incredibly unique conversations, which I think even now already, because of how accelerating time is, already historical value, despite being with people that are still alive. So I think you can have incredible conversations, and I'm trying to have as many as possible. Next year's, I aiming to continue those, and maybe afterwards in the form of a PhD.
Another aspect of it is, when these scholars were coming to China, did they have this in the back of their mind that this is going to be completely significant in terms of improving the relations between the two countries, or in that moment in time they were just coming like out of curiosity? Has there been a theme in which you've noticed that people who came just out of curiosity, now when they look at it in retrospect, realize how important it was that they didn't know maybe in the moment?
I think they were aware they were playing a key historical role. I think it was even mentioned to them. However, I would like to take this question a little bit further historically. Like the people that set up the negotiations, for them, when they started doing this, many of them will probably have expected to never come to China. If you started studying this in the 60s, in the 70s, many of them would have probably thought, you know, chance I'll ever come to China is relatively low, and they were studying this out of interest. And I've spoken to people that said, you know, no one was as surprised that China opened up that I was. Like, I expected to spend my entire life outside of this, like in academia. So for them it was thrilling to see, you know, you could come to China. And many of them were probably realizing how important this was historically. And I think for the first 8 and the 50 after, they also realized they were playing a critical role. Although it was the case, there were still foreigners, especially from African countries, which China had friendly relations with, and even Europeans, like myself. They still had these type of engagements. But there weren't any Americans, so many Europeans were probably a little bit sad to see their privilege taken away. But these Americans were aware that they were doing something critical, and many of them also mentioned me, you know, I wanted to be seen as well behaved. And they were already also a bit more mature, because they were very fluent in Mandarin. They were very far in their PhD. They were more like late 30s, I would say. Sorry, like late 20s.
Another aspect of it was the business development that was happening during that time. It was not only like educational exchanges that were happening, but a lot of joint ventures were coming up during that time. Can you share a little bit more of what you discovered during your research about that aspect of it?
Well, I think one of the most interesting things today is that we often talk about, you know, it was so naive of the United States to engage with China in this way. Like, should we have engaged with a rival power in the development? And I would say what you should do if you want to answer that is speak to the people who actually did that. Like, you should ask them, how did you feel about it? How did you think about it? Did you talk about this? That's something that I do. And I agree with you that a few years after, especially, like this started to rapidly come up. Both sides were interested in having this type of engagement. People often think that America want to have this type of engagement because they want to make China a liberal democracy like its own. That's not true. If you speak with the people involved, they were not trying to do that. What they were trying to do is to build a buffer against the never-ending Cold War, against the USSR, the great bear up north. So they were both trying to basically, they figured, you know, the enemy is my enemy almost. So the US considered it in their own interest to help China develop educationally and technologically. And at the same time, Deng knew that without the US help, most likely their project will not be as successful. So both sides are very interested in working together under these very specific historical circumstances. And then you, of course, need people to negotiate, to arrange that. And many of these first Americans looking for interesting work were able to do that. And speaking with them, you learn on how actually that went, and it goes beyond just you give people technology, goodbye. How it works is that you do negotiations, you talk about things. So you learn about how, for instance, like, is a financial model made? Or why do you consider this to be of importance? And the American and the Chinese side had different incentives. The American side wanted to make money. The Chinese side wanted to have the best technology. I have people in interviews that talked about, you know, that the Chinese side at least said explicitly, we don't just want technology got laying around, we want to have the best technology you guys have. So both sides had different incentives on what they wanted to achieve through these tech transfers.
There are many people who believe that you can have people-to-people exchanges, you can have integrated businesses and economies, but still when things turn sour, all these things don't matter as much because people-to-people exchanges can stop, businesses can get disintegrated, and then you have a kind of dynamics like you have today in which there are talks of decoupling. But do you believe that whatever was happening in 1978 is still relevant today and those people-to-people exchanges can still help bring US and China together?
People-to-people exchange becomes only more important because people-to-people exchange is the foundation of any relationship. That's why I worry about so much that there are only 800 Americans in China. Because you care about something when you know it's people. Like you care about something when there are people there that you love. And that's exactly what people-to-people exchanges do, is through having people-to-people engagement that stereotypes get broken, that you learn about the other side, that you start caring about the other side. And it's only if you are here for longer periods of time that you understand the other sides, how they think, how they act, subtleties in cultural exchanges. And that's why I think the very first group of Americans here was so well able to do its job, and why I worry that future policymakers, this is not an issue 5 years down the line, maybe not even 10 years down the line, but it is 20 years, are no longer here. I think they need to have that engagement, not just to understand China, but to care about China. Yeah, you can care about China to just care about its history, but developing friendships with its people, I think that's how you start to have a real stake in the relationship. And I worry that Americans and Chinese are only going to meet to headbutt the negotiation table. And that is a prospect that terrifies me.
Koen, you're doing this incredible work in which you're trying to preserve this oral history, but what do you think the impact of this work is going to be? Maybe 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, or 20 years down the line?
Where I see this taking like 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, I think my goal will always be the same. And that is to contribute to mutually beneficial, prosperous, stable, normalized US-China relations. And the best way I see that I can do that is by helping not just research, but also facilitate US-China academic relations. Right now, in the future think I will increasingly expand it to also cover more general US-China relations, like feature its experts, its scholars, help facilitate that. So in the short run, I want to continue doing this research. I want to make sure that we have a good understanding of how the relations are re-established, speak with as many people as possible, preserve that voice for current and future policymakers on this critical historical epoch. And based on those interviews, I want to write a book. I'm already writing a book. I think it's going quite smoothly. I aim to publish it in the next 2 years on both sides of the Pacific, in both languages. Maybe translate it myself by that time. We'll see.
That's a huge commitment.
We'll see. I had a friend once that said, jokingly, semi-jokingly, that he'll translate it for me. So I may need to keep him up with that. But what I especially see is then going maybe towards a PhD at an American university to make sure, I have continuous credentials on both sides. So I'm taken seriously with both sides. I think I already have that, but to keep working on that. And then, facilitate these type of track 1.5, track 2 dialogues. I think that's my dream, to be able to be a trusted, neutral, to the extent that's possible, player in these type of engagements. And I think the credentials I'm building up right now, the people I'm meeting, the people I'm speaking with, they are both the older generation that's advising them, and the current generation that's rising up to basically meet those challenges. And I hope to contribute to making sure these young people engage with each other, talk with each other. And then when I meet them again, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now, at negotiations, I hope they'll remember me and the conversations they had to each other through the things that I facilitated, maybe had a listen to the type of conversations I had, to make sure that they understand each other. That's not the first time headbutting at a negotiation table, but they're meeting at friends that understand each other.
Well, all the best for your future endeavors, and thank you for joining us for this segment.
Thank you for making time. I really loved the conversation.